"You're just a burden we've been carrying for years," my daughter-in-law said on Christmas Eve while reaching for the cranberry sauce as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. The words settled over the dining room heavier than the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker suddenly felt too loud. I looked down at the gold-rimmed plate in front of me, the same Christmas china I had carefully unpacked every December for more than 30 years, and for a moment I honestly wondered if I had heard her wrong. Melissa sat across from me in a cream-colored sweater dress, her wine glass balanced delicately between manicured fingers, her blonde hair perfectly curled despite the snowstorm outside. She looked calm, comfortable, like someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind long before she finally decided to say it out loud. Beside her, my son Daniel stared at his mashed potatoes. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. That hurt more than her words ever could. Outside, snow pressed softly against the windows of the house my late husband and I had bought 41 years ago. The Christmas tree near the fireplace glowed with white lights and handmade ornaments collected across decades of family vacations, school plays, and childhood memories. I remembered when Daniel was 8 years old and cried because he thought Santa might not find our house during a blizzard. I remembered Michael lifting him onto his shoulders so he could place the star on top of the tree. I remembered laughter filling these walls so loudly that neighbors could hear us from the sidewalk. But that night, the house felt cold in a way no fireplace could fix. "Melissa," Sophie whispered quietly from the end of the table. My 16-year-old granddaughter looked horrified, her blue eyes darting nervously toward me. "That's not funny." Melissa gave a small shrug before taking a sip of wine. "I wasn't joking." Daniel finally exhaled slowly beside her, rubbing his forehead like a man exhausted from carrying a weight no one else could see. "Mom," he muttered carefully. "She didn't mean it the way it sounded." I almost laughed at that. There was no other way it could have sounded. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my untouched plate. My hands trembled slightly, though I tried not to let anyone notice. The turkey sat in the center of the table surrounded by bowls of sweet potatoes, green beans, stuffing, and homemade rolls I had spent 2 days preparing. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in this kitchen listening to Nat King Cole Christmas songs while basting the turkey exactly the way Michael used to love it. I had even worn the pearl earrings he gave me on our 30th anniversary, because somehow it still comforted me to feel close to him during the holidays. Michael had been gone for 11 months. 11 months since the heart attack that split my life into a before and after. The first Christmas without him already felt unbearable before Melissa decided to make it worse. "I see," I said quietly. My own voice surprised me. Calm, steady, almost detached. Melissa leaned back in her chair as though relieved the words had finally been spoken. "Look, Evelyn, someone had to say it eventually. This house is too much for everyone now. Daniel and I have been trying to keep things together, but honestly, it's exhausting." Keep things together. I nearly looked around the room searching for evidence of everything they had supposedly sacrificed for me. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. The property taxes came directly from the trust Michael established before he died. Even the groceries for tonight's dinner had been purchased with my own credit card. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Melissa just means maybe it's time to think about some changes." Changes. That word had become very popular in this house lately. Small changes at first. Melissa rearranging kitchen cabinets without asking me. Melissa boxing up some of Michael's old clothes because she said seeing them around was unhealthy for everyone. Melissa suggesting I move my bedroom downstairs because climbing stairs at my age wasn't safe anymore. Every change arrived wrapped in concern. Every insult delivered with a smile. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up from the table. The old hardwood floor creaked beneath my feet. Sophie immediately looked like she wanted to stand too, but I gave her a small smile before she could speak. "Dinner's getting cold," I said softly. "You should all eat." Daniel finally looked up at me then, guilt flickering briefly across his face. For 1 second, I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. Then Melissa reached for his hand under the table, and the expression disappeared. Just like that. I walked toward the kitchen carrying my untouched plate. The sink overlooked the backyard where snow covered the garden Michael and I planted together 20 years ago. He used to string lights along the fence every December while drinking terrible instant coffee from an old thermos. Last Christmas he stood exactly outside that window wearing his thick brown coat and waving at me like an idiot because he knew it always made me laugh. I gripped the edge of the sink harder than I meant to. My reflection in the dark glass looked older than 71. Smaller somehow. Behind me, I could still hear silverware against plates and Melissa talking quietly like nothing important had happened. That was the part one couldn't understand. How could someone say something so cruel and continue eating dinner afterward? I rinsed my plate slowly even though there was barely any food on it. My chest felt hollow. Not shattered. Not angry. Just empty. As if something inside me had quietly gone numb. Then I noticed it. Sitting near the coffee maker beside the stack of unopened Christmas cards was a folder I had never seen before. A blue folder with the logo of a real estate company stamped across the front. Someone had tucked it halfway beneath a pile of mail, probably assuming I wouldn't notice. My stomach tightened instantly. I glanced toward the dining room. Daniel and Melissa were still talking quietly. Sophie was staring at me from the table, her face pale with worry. Slowly, I pulled the folder closer. Inside were photographs of my house, my living room, my kitchen, my bedroom. Beneath the photographs sat paperwork dated 3 weeks earlier. Preliminary property valuation. Estimated market listing price. Potential renovation recommendations before sale. Sale. My fingers froze against the paper. For a long moment, I simply stood there listening to the faint crackle of the fireplace behind me. Michael's voice echoed suddenly inside my memory from months before his death. If anyone ever treats this house like a transaction instead of a home, don't trust them, Evie. At the time, I thought he was talking about greedy contractors or rising property taxes. I never imagined he meant our own family. I slid the folder shut just as footsteps approached behind me. Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway holding her wine glass. "Oh," she said smoothly when she noticed the folder in my hands. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." I looked at her carefully then. Really looked at her. The polished smile. The calculated calm. The impatience hidden beneath fake concern. And for the first time since Michael died, I understood something clearly. They weren't waiting for me to heal. They were waiting for me to disappear. Melissa took the folder from my hands with the same expression someone might use while picking up a grocery list left on the counter. Calm. Unbothered. Almost amused. "Daniel wanted to wait until after the holidays," she said lightly as she slid the papers back inside. "We did not want to upset you." Upset me? I stared at her for a long moment, trying to understand how the woman standing in my kitchen could say something like that, while the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey still lingered in the air around us. "You are selling my house?" I asked quietly. Melissa tilted her head slightly. "Evelyn, come on. You know this place is too much now. The stairs alone are dangerous for someone your age." Someone your age. I had heard that phrase so many times over the past year that it no longer sounded accidental. It sounded strategic. Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. His shoulders tensed the moment he realized what I had found. "Mom," he started carefully. "We were going to explain everything." I looked at my son standing there in the kitchen where I used to pack his school lunches every morning before work. I remembered him at 10 years old sitting at this same counter eating cereal while telling me he wanted to become an architect because he loved drawing houses. He used to call this kitchen the heart of the home. Now he stood there discussing selling it like it was a used car nobody wanted anymore. "When?" I asked. Daniel blinked. "What? When were you planning to tell me?" He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes again. "After New Year's. Melissa found a really nice retirement community outside Columbus. They have activities and medical staff and transportation services." Retirement community. The words landed softly but left bruises all the same. I glanced past them toward the dining room where the Christmas tree lights reflected faintly against the dark windows. Michael and I bought that tree at a farm nearly 20 years ago after a snowstorm forced us to drive home at 15 miles per hour the entire way. We laughed the whole drive because the tree barely fit on top of our old station wagon. That memory felt more alive to me than the conversation happening now. "You already chose a place for me," I said softly. Melissa crossed her arms. "We are trying to help you." I almost asked who exactly this arrangement was helping. But exhaustion settled over me before the words could leave my mouth. Grief changes people in strange ways. Sometimes it makes you louder. Sometimes it makes you disappear quietly while everyone around you assumes you are too broken to notice what is happening. Since Michael died, people had started speaking around me instead of to me. Decisions happened in whispers. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Even my own belongings seemed to shift around the house without explanation. Last month I spent 40 minutes looking for the photo album from our trip to Maine only to discover Melissa had packed it into a box in the basement labeled old items. Old items. 41 years of marriage reduced to storage. Grandma! Sophie's voice broke gently into the silence behind us. She stood near the hallway clutching her phone tightly against her chest. Unlike her parents, she looked genuinely upset. Do you want me to help you upstairs? Melissa immediately sighed. Sophie, do not make this dramatic. Sophie ignored her mother completely and kept looking at me instead. Grandma! I gave her a small nod. I am all right, sweetheart. But I was not. Not really. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly, quietly, hidden inside little moments that seem harmless until one day you step back and realize they formed a pattern all along. I remembered last spring when Melissa insisted on handling all the mail because she said I should not stress over bills anymore. I remembered Daniel changing the password on the family streaming account and laughing awkwardly when I asked why mine no longer worked. I remembered coming downstairs one morning to find movers taking Michael's leather recliner out of the living room because Melissa had donated it while I was asleep. It did not fit the new design, she said afterward while drinking coffee from my favorite mug. At the time, I told myself they were grieving too. I told myself families struggle after loss. I made excuses because the alternative hurt too much to face. You should sit down, Daniel said quietly now, gesturing toward the kitchen table. You look pale. Funny how concern always appeared after damage had already been done. No, I replied softly. I think I would like to go upstairs. Melissa stepped aside immediately. That is probably best. Best. Everything was always best for me lately. Smaller meals because heavy food was supposedly hard on older stomachs. Earlier bedtimes because rest was important at my age. Fewer responsibilities because they wanted me to relax. Piece by piece they had been shrinking my life right in front of me. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand brushing against the wooden railing Michael refinished himself 15 years ago. Halfway up, I paused beside the family photo wall. Melissa had recently rearranged the frames. The newer photographs sat at eye level now. Daniel and Melissa smiling on a beach in Florida. Sophie during her school theater performance. Holiday cards from friends I barely recognized. My older photographs with Michael had been moved higher, almost out of reach. I stood there staring at one picture in particular. Michael holding me close during our 40th anniversary dinner. He wore his navy suit. I wore the dark green dress he always loved. We looked happy, safe, untouchable. A sudden ache spread through my chest so sharply I had to grip the railing tighter. Not because I missed the house. Not because of the trust or the real estate papers or the retirement home they already selected without asking me. I ached because Michael was not here to see what his family had become. My bedroom felt colder than usual when I entered. Someone had already removed several boxes from the closet. Empty spaces lined the shelves where Michael's winter coats once hung. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed and looked around the room we shared for 4 decades. The pale blue curtains. The grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner. The tiny crack in the ceiling Michael always promised to fix but never did because he said it gave the room character. For the first time since his funeral, I let myself cry. Quietly. Not loudly enough for anyone downstairs to hear. Just enough to release the pressure building behind my ribs for months. Eventually I wiped my face and reached toward the nightstand for a tissue. That was when I noticed the drawer was slightly open. Strange. I always kept it closed. Slowly, I pulled the drawer farther open. Inside sat Michael's old reading glasses, a flashlight, loose batteries, and beneath them something I had never seen before. A small brass key taped underneath the drawer with a folded note attached. My breath caught instantly. The handwriting belonged to Michael. Even after 11 months, I recognized every curve of every letter immediately. Evie, if you are reading this, it means something is wrong. Do not trust appearances. And do not let anyone rush you out of this house. The key opens the cedar box in the attic. Read everything before making decisions. I stared at the note so long my vision blurred again. Downstairs, faint laughter drifted upward from the dining room. Melissa was laughing at something on television. Like nothing had changed. Like Christmas Eve had continued exactly as planned. But sitting there in the dim bedroom light with Michael's handwriting trembling in my hands, I realized something important. My husband had known something before he died. And whatever he left inside that attic box was never meant for Daniel or Melissa to find. I did not sleep that night. Long after the Christmas music downstairs stopped and the lights in the hallway dimmed, I remained sitting on the edge of my bed with Michael's note folded tightly in my hands. Snow continued falling outside, covering the backyard in thick white silence. Every now and then the old pipes inside the walls creaked softly, the same way they always had during winter storms. Usually those sounds comforted me. Michael used to joke that the house talked more than most people. But that night, the silence inside those walls felt different. Heavy. Watchful. Around 1 a.m, I finally stood and walked toward the bedroom window. Daniel's car sat in the driveway beside Melissa's white SUV, both dusted with snow beneath the porch lights. For a brief moment I imagined waking Michael beside me and telling him everything that happened downstairs. I could almost hear the sharp breath he would take whenever something angered him. Michael had never been cruel, but he always saw through people faster than I did. Especially Melissa. The first time she visited this house nearly 18 years ago, she complimented the kitchen countertops before she complimented Daniel. At the time I laughed about it afterward. Michael did not. That woman notices assets before people, he told me quietly one evening while washing dishes. I accused him of being unfair. Looking back now, I wish I had listened more carefully. I tucked the brass key into the pocket of my robe and quietly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas lights downstairs. I moved slowly toward the attic ladder near the upstairs linen closet, careful not to let the old wooden floorboards creak too loudly beneath my feet. The house had always been loud at night. Every step carried memories. Every hallway seemed to hold echoes of old conversations and holiday mornings and birthdays long gone. When Daniel was little, he used to hide in the attic during thunderstorms because he thought the roof made him closer to heaven. Michael eventually turned part of the attic into a small storage room with cedar shelves and old trunks stacked neatly along the walls. We had not touched most of it in years. I lowered the attic ladder carefully and climbed upward into the darkness. Cold air immediately wrapped around me. The attic smelled like cedar wood, dust, and old paper. Moonlight filtered faintly through the small round window near the roofline, casting pale silver light across the room. I spotted the cedar box almost immediately. It sat beneath an old quilt in the far corner beside Michael's fishing gear. My hand shook slightly as I carried it toward the window. The brass key slid smoothly into the lock. For a moment I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to believe none of this was real. That Melissa's cruelty downstairs came from stress. That Daniel had simply lost his way while grieving his father. That families recovered from things like this all the time. But deep down, another part of me already understood. Michael left this box because he knew something I did not. Slowly I opened it. Inside sat several neatly organized folders, legal documents, handwritten letters, and a small leather journal I instantly recognized from Michael's office. On top rested another envelope with my name written across the front in his careful handwriting. Evie, if you are reading this, I am probably gone. And if Daniel and Melissa are pressuring you about this house, then my instincts were right. My chest tightened so sharply I had to pause before continuing. I always worried that grief would make you too trusting after I was gone. You see the best in people even when they do not deserve it. That is one of the reasons I loved you. But it also made me afraid for you. Especially after the refinancing incident 2 years ago. Refinancing incident. I frowned immediately, trying to remember. Then slowly pieces returned. 2 years earlier Daniel asked Michael for temporary financial help after a business investment went wrong. Melissa claimed they only needed short-term assistance until a property deal closed. Michael handled the conversation privately and later told me everything was resolved. I never thought about it again. My eyes moved lower across the letter. I discovered Melissa had attempted to use this house as collateral without your knowledge. Daniel claimed he did not understand the paperwork she submitted, but I stopped the process before any damage was done. Since then, I quietly transferred full ownership of the property and all associated trust protections into your name alone. No sale can legally happen without your direct written approval. I sat frozen in the dim attic light. Full ownership. My name alone. Downstairs, I could faintly hear the refrigerator humming through the floorboards beneath me. Michael's words blurred slightly as tears filled my eyes again. I continued reading. I did not tell Daniel because I wanted to believe he would eventually recognize the kind of person he married. Maybe grief will wake him up after I am gone. Maybe it will not. But you need to know this house belongs to you, Evelyn. Not because of money. Because you built this family inside these walls. Never let anyone convince you that your life can be packed into boxes for their convenience. I lowered the letter slowly into my lap. For several minutes I simply sat there listening to the storm outside. Snow tapped softly against the attic window while old memories drifted through my mind one after another. Daniel running through the backyard holding sparklers during 4th of July cookouts. Michael carrying sleepy grandchildren upstairs after Christmas dinner. Birthday cakes. School dances. Late-night conversations at the kitchen table after hard days. Entire decades of love stitched quietly into this house. And downstairs, beneath this same roof, my own son was discussing retirement communities while his wife prepared to sell the home his father protected for 41 years. I opened the leather journal next. Most pages contain Michael's usual notes about investments, repairs, and trust paperwork. But halfway through the journal, one entry caught my attention immediately. Melissa asked again about changing the trust structure today. She framed it as simplifying future inheritance issues, but her questions were far too specific. She wanted timelines, liquid asset details, property transfer procedures. Daniel looked uncomfortable the entire conversation. I do not think he realizes how transparent she has become. Another entry 3 months later read, "Caught Melissa photographing financial documents in my office while she thought nobody was home. She claimed she was looking for printer paper. I pretended to believe her." A coldness spread through me unlike anything I had felt since Michael's funeral. Not shock exactly. Confirmation. Quiet, terrible confirmation. Suddenly footsteps creaked below me. I froze instantly. The attic floor groaned softly under my knees as I turned toward the ladder. Someone was upstairs. My heart began pounding so loudly I worried they would hear it through the ceiling. Then came Sophie's voice, low and careful. "Grandma." Relief washed through me so suddenly I nearly laughed. I climbed down slowly and found Sophie standing in the dark hallway wrapped in an oversized sweatshirt, her blonde hair messy from sleep. But her expression looked wide awake. Worried. Serious. "What are you doing up?" I whispered. Sophie glanced nervously toward her parents' bedroom downstairs before looking back at me. I heard Mom and Dad talking. Something in her voice made my stomach tighten immediately. "About what?" Sophie swallowed hard. "About you." She hesitated briefly before pulling her phone from her sweatshirt pocket. "Grandma, I think there is something you need to see." Sophie glanced over her shoulder nervously before stepping into my bedroom and quietly closing the door behind her. The soft click of the latch sounded strangely loud in the middle of the silent house. I could still feel Michael's note folded inside the pocket of my robe like a heartbeat against my side. Sophie climbed onto the edge of the bed beside me and unlocked her phone with trembling fingers. "I was downstairs getting water," she whispered. "Mom and Dad thought I was asleep." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I noticed then that her eyes looked red, as if she had already been crying before she came upstairs. Sophie had always been sensitive. Even as a little girl she could sense tension before anyone else noticed it. When Daniel and Melissa fought quietly in the kitchen years ago, Sophie used to crawl into my lap during family dinners without saying a word. She never needed explanations. Children understand more than adults realize. "What did you hear?" I asked softly. Sophie swallowed hard and looked down at her phone screen. "Mom said if you refuse to leave after New Year's, they may have to force the issue." A cold numbness spread slowly through my chest. "Force the issue," I repeated quietly. Sophie nodded. "Dad sounded nervous, but Mom kept saying you were emotionally attached to the house, and that once you moved into the retirement place, you would eventually adjust." "Retirement place?" Even hearing the words from Sophie somehow made everything feel uglier, more deliberate. Then Mom said something about listing the house by February because the market is supposed to get better in spring. My eyes drifted slowly toward the bedroom walls around me. The pale blue wallpaper. The framed photographs. The old wooden dresser Michael restored himself one summer after buying it from an antique shop outside Cincinnati. They were discussing timelines for selling this room while I still slept inside it. Sophie turned the phone toward me carefully. There is more. A text thread filled the screen. Melissa's name sat at the top beside a recent string of messages exchanged with someone saved as Karen Realty. My stomach tightened immediately. Melissa. Once Evelyn is settled into assisted living, we can move quickly. Karen Realty. Do you anticipate resistance? Melissa. Emotional resistance, yes. Legal resistance, probably not. She is confused most days now. I stared at the words for so long they almost stopped looking real. Confused most days now. The sentence echoed inside my mind with terrifying clarity. I had spent months grieving my husband while living inside a house where someone was quietly building a case against my competence. Grandma. Sophie touched my arm gently. You are not confused. I looked at her then. Truly looked at her. She still had traces of childhood softness in her face, but something older sat behind her eyes tonight. Disappointment. Hurt. The painful realization that parents are not always good people. How long have you known? I asked carefully. Sophie lowered her gaze. A while. The answer landed harder than I expected. Why did you not tell me? She immediately looked ashamed. I thought maybe I was misunderstanding things at first. Mom always says she is trying to help you. And Dad. Her voice trailed off softly. Dad just goes along with whatever keeps the peace. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Daniel lately. Not cruel in obvious ways. Just weak. Weakness can destroy people almost as efficiently as cruelty if left unchecked long enough. Sophie continued quietly. A few months ago I heard Mom telling Aunt Rebecca that this house was wasted on one person, and that you would never survive alone here anyway. Survive alone. The strange thing was that I already had been surviving alone. For 11 months. I paid my bills, managed the house, cooked my meals, attended doctor appointments by myself. Grief did not erase my ability to think clearly. But somewhere along the way, Melissa had started treating sorrow like evidence of incompetence. And Daniel let her. Sophie hesitated before speaking again. There is something else. She opened another message thread. This one contained photographs. My breath caught instantly. They were pictures of my bedroom. My closets. The attic staircase. Melissa had apparently been sending photographs of the house to the realtor for weeks. Some of the pictures were taken while I was clearly home. One image showed the kitchen window glowing softly at night while my silhouette stood near the sink. The sight unsettled me deeply. She said staging will be easier once personal clutter is removed, Sophie whispered bitterly. Personal clutter. 41 years of marriage reduced to clutter. I looked toward the hallway instinctively, half expecting Melissa to suddenly appear smiling in the doorway holding another glass of wine while pretending none of this existed. But the house remained quiet. Downstairs the dishwasher hummed faintly. Somewhere outside, snowplows scraped slowly along the distant road. Christmas Eve continued moving forward, while my understanding of my own family quietly collapsed around me. Sophie locked her phone and sat silently beside me for a few moments. Then finally she asked the question I had been avoiding since dinner. What are you going to do? I did not answer right away. Instead I stood slowly and walked toward the dresser mirror across the room. My reflection stared back at me beneath the dim bedside lamp. Silver hair slightly disheveled. Tired blue eyes. Wrinkles grief had deepened over the past year. Melissa probably saw an old woman nearing the end of her usefulness. Someone fragile. Someone easy to pressure. But standing there in the quiet room Michael and I shared for decades, I suddenly remembered something my father once told me when I was young. Kind people are often mistaken for weak people because they do not spend their lives proving otherwise. I reached into my robe pocket and touched the folded note again. Michael trusted me to protect what we built together. Not just the house. The truth. The dignity of our life. I turned back toward Sophie carefully. For now, I said softly, We let them think I know nothing. Sophie blinked in surprise. What? Your mother believes I am too emotional and confused to notice what she is doing. Your father believes avoiding conflict will somehow protect him from consequences. I think we should allow them both to stay comfortable for a little longer. Sophie stared at me for several seconds before something shifted in her expression. Understanding. Grandma, she whispered slowly. You sound like Grandpa. Despite everything, a small smile touched my face for the first time that night. Michael always said patience unsettled dishonest people more than anger ever could. Angry people can be dismissed. Quiet people make others nervous. I walked toward the nightstand and carefully placed Michael's letter inside the drawer again beside the brass key. Then I looked back at Sophie. Tomorrow morning, I said calmly, I want you to act normal. Normal. Christmas normal. She let out a small nervous laugh. I do not think this family remembers what normal looks like anymore. That hurt because it was true. I moved closer and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face the same way I used to when she was little. None of this is your fault, sweetheart. Sophie's eyes filled immediately with tears she clearly had been trying to hold back for hours. I hate hearing them talk about you like that, she whispered. Grandpa loved this house. He loved you. My throat tightened painfully again at the mention of Michael. I know. Sophie suddenly wrapped her arms around me, and for a moment I simply held my granddaughter quietly while snow continued falling outside the bedroom window. She felt small again in my arms despite being nearly grown now. Fragile. Scared. The way families become when truth finally begins surfacing after years hidden beneath polite smiles and holiday dinners. Eventually Sophie pulled away and wiped her eyes quickly. Mom already contacted 2 retirement communities, she admitted softly. I saw brochures in her office drawer last week. I nodded slowly. Somehow that no longer surprised me. Melissa had been planning this for a long time, probably even before Michael died. The realization should have shattered me completely. Instead it did something stranger. It cleared the fog from my mind. Grief had kept me emotionally underwater for nearly a year. Tonight, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something rise quietly beneath the sadness. Clarity. And beneath that clarity sat something colder. Resolve. Christmas morning arrived quietly beneath 6 inches of fresh snow. Sunlight spilled across the backyard in pale silver streaks, making the untouched snowdrift sparkle beyond the kitchen windows. For a few brief seconds after waking, I forgot everything. I forgot the folder, the text messages, the real estate paperwork. I forgot Melissa's cold voice across the dinner table and Daniel's silence beside her. Then reality returned all at once the moment I rolled over and saw Michael's folded note still resting on the nightstand beside the brass key. I sat there for several minutes staring at it while the house slowly woke around me. Pipes creaked softly inside the walls. Someone downstairs opened the refrigerator. The coffee machine beeped faintly from the kitchen. Normal Christmas sounds. Ordinary family sounds. Strange how betrayal can exist quietly beneath routines that once felt comforting. I dressed carefully that morning. Not because anyone downstairs deserved the effort, but because Michael always loved Christmas mornings. He used to tease me for wearing matching holiday pajamas well into my 60s. You look like the cheerful manager of a very aggressive gingerbread bakery, he once told me while laughing so hard he nearly spilled coffee across the couch. The memory hit me so unexpectedly that I had to pause halfway through buttoning my sweater. Grief was strange that way. One moment numbness. The next, memories sharp enough to stop your breathing. When I finally walked downstairs, the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen. Melissa stood near the stove wearing a soft green sweater and pearl earrings, looking every bit like the perfect suburban hostess from a holiday catalog. If someone walked into the house at that exact moment, they would think she was caring, warm, generous even. That was the danger of people like Melissa. Cruelty hidden beneath polished manners always survives longer, because nobody wants to believe it exists. Merry Christmas, she said smoothly when she noticed me entering the kitchen. Her voice sounded perfectly pleasant, as though the previous night had never happened at all. Coffee is fresh. I nodded politely. Thank you. Daniel sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone while half watching a morning football game on television. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath his eyes now that had not existed before Michael died. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the text messages. Emotional resistance. Confused most days now. The pity disappeared quickly after that. Sophie entered the kitchen a few seconds later carrying a plate of cinnamon rolls. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Neither of us mentioned the attic conversation from the night before. We did not need to. Melissa turned toward the oven. I thought we could open presents before brunch this year. Her tone sounded bright and cheerful, but I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders every time she glanced at me. She knew I had seen the folder. She just did not yet realize how much more I knew now. That sounds lovely, I replied calmly. Daniel finally looked up from his phone. His expression carried the same awkward discomfort he had worn since dinner. Guilt looked heavy on him this morning. Good. Let it. We gathered in the living room an hour later beneath the glowing Christmas tree. The room looked beautiful despite everything. White lights reflected softly against the windows while snow continued drifting quietly outside. Stockings still hung above the fireplace exactly where Michael always insisted they belonged. Mine still had my name embroidered in gold thread beside his. Seeing his stocking there nearly broke me all over again. Melissa handed out wrapped presents with careful efficiency, while Christmas music played softly from the speakers near the bookshelf. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor beside me while Daniel occupied Michael's old recliner without seeming to realize the significance of it. I noticed Melissa watching me occasionally whenever conversations drifted toward the house or future plans. She was measuring my reactions carefully now, waiting for emotional instability, looking for weakness. Instead, I smiled politely through the entire morning. I complimented Sophie's new winter boots. Thanked Daniel for the framed family photograph. He clearly forgot to sign his name on until the last second. I even praised Melissa's cinnamon rolls. The more composed I remained, the more unsettled she became. Around noon, Melissa disappeared briefly upstairs while Daniel stepped outside to shovel snow near the driveway. Sophie glanced toward the staircase before leaning closer beside me on the couch. "Grandma," she whispered carefully. "Mom has another folder in her office." I kept my eyes on the Christmas tree. What kind of folder? I think legal papers. My pulse slowed strangely instead of speeding up. Calm had begun replacing panic sometime during the night. Maybe because the truth was no longer uncertain. Maybe because Michael already prepared for this long before I understood what was happening. "Did you see what was inside?" Sophie nodded slightly. "Some papers had your name on them." Before I could respond, Melissa's voice floated down from upstairs. "Daniel? Can you help me with something?" Sophie immediately leaned back against the couch as Melissa re-entered the room carrying another tray of coffee mugs. Her smile looked slightly forced now. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "I was actually hoping we could talk later today. About practical things." Practical things. There it was again. Everything reduced to logistics. "Of course," I replied calmly. Melissa blinked almost imperceptibly, clearly expecting hesitation or emotion. Instead, she received polite cooperation. I could practically see the confusion behind her eyes. Daniel returned inside moments later carrying cold air and snowflakes on his coat. "Driveway is clear," he announced while removing his gloves. "The roads are still bad though." Melissa gave a quick nod. "Probably best nobody goes anywhere today." Nobody. Another tiny word choice that suddenly stood out differently now. Not family. Not us. Nobody. As though movement itself required permission. I watched them carefully for the rest of the afternoon. Once you recognize manipulation, you start seeing it everywhere. Melissa answering questions directed at me before I could speak. Daniel mentioning downsizing eventually, while carefully avoiding eye contact. The way Melissa subtly corrected details about my medications or appointments even when she was wrong. Small things. Tiny things. But together they painted an ugly picture. They were building a narrative. Old age. Forgetfulness. Dependence. Fragility. It suddenly became obvious why Melissa photographed the house. Why she controlled the mail. Why she kept insisting retirement communities were safer. She was not just trying to remove me from the home. She was preparing to justify it. By late afternoon, snow had thickened outside again, coating the neighborhood in deep quiet stillness. Sophie helped me clear dishes after brunch while Melissa and Daniel argued softly in the pantry. I could not hear every word, but one sentence drifted clearly through the cracked doorway. "She is acting different," Melissa whispered sharply. "Well, maybe because you told my mother she was a burden on Christmas Eve," Daniel muttered back. The silence that followed felt tense. Then Melissa answered in a colder voice than I had heard all morning. "Somebody had to force reality eventually." I continued rinsing plates slowly while pretending not to notice anything. Beside me, Sophie looked furious. But I gently touched her hand once beneath the dish towel, silently asking her not to react. Patience. Michael always believed truth exposed itself fastest when dishonest people felt comfortable. That evening after dinner, Melissa finally approached me directly while Daniel carried boxes of old ornaments toward the basement. "Evelyn," she began carefully, "there is something Daniel and I think would really improve your quality of life." I folded a blanket neatly across the couch before answering. "Is there?" She smiled tightly. "We found a beautiful retirement community outside Columbus. It has private gardens, transportation services, medical support, social events." Her voice faded softly into the background while I watched snow falling outside the window behind her shoulder. Somewhere inside me, fear should have existed, but strangely it no longer did. Instead, I thought about Michael sitting in his office years ago, quietly changing trust documents while protecting me from people we once considered family. Melissa kept talking. "They even have memory care specialists if your condition progresses later on." Condition? There it was. Finally spoken aloud. I looked at her carefully then. Really carefully. And for the first time I realized something important. Melissa was not nervous because I was weak. She was nervous because she knew exactly what she was doing. Melissa smiled pleasantly while describing memory care specialists as though she were recommending a nice vacation resort instead of planning my removal from the home I built with my husband. I stood near the living room window with my hands folded loosely in front of me, listening quietly while snow drifted past the porch lights outside. "The community really focuses on dignity and comfort," she continued smoothly. "A lot of families make this transition earlier now before things become more difficult emotionally." Earlier. Transition. Emotionally. She wrapped cruelty in polished language so carefully that someone overhearing the conversation might think she was compassionate. That was what made her dangerous. Daniel entered the room carrying another storage box from the basement just as Melissa finished speaking. The moment he noticed my expression, his shoulders tightened slightly. "Mom," he said cautiously, "nobody is trying to force you into anything." Melissa glanced at him almost imperceptibly before returning her attention to me. "Of course not," she added quickly. "We just want what is best for you." Best for me. I wondered how many terrible decisions throughout history were introduced with those exact words. I looked at Daniel carefully. "Did your father ever tell you what he said the day we bought this house?" Daniel blinked in surprise at the question. "What?" "He stood in the driveway holding those awful gas station flowers he bought because he forgot our anniversary earlier that week. Despite everything, the memory almost made me smile. And he told me no matter what happened in life, this house would always belong to the people who filled it with love." Daniel's expression softened slightly. For one painful second, I saw recognition flicker across his face. Then Melissa stepped closer beside him. "Michael also believed in practicality," she replied gently. "And realistically, this house is not manageable for one person anymore." There it was again. Not manageable. Every conversation somehow circled back toward my supposed inability to function independently. I noticed now how carefully Melissa repeated those ideas in front of Daniel, like rehearsing lines in a script she wanted him to believe. "I am tired," I said quietly instead of arguing. Melissa immediately relaxed. Daniel looked relieved. "Maybe we can continue this conversation after the holidays," he offered. "Maybe," I answered softly. Then I turned and walked upstairs without another word. Behind me, I heard Melissa exhale quietly before whispering something too low for me to hear. But I did not need the exact words anymore. I already understood the role she expected me to play. Grieving widow. Forgetful old woman. Emotional burden. Convenient obstacle standing between them and the life they wanted. My bedroom felt colder than usual that night. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the snow-covered backyard, while Michael's journal rested open beside me. Earlier, while everyone watched television downstairs, I read more entries hidden among the trust documents. The deeper I read, the more carefully Michael's concerns unfolded across the pages. September 14th. Melissa asked detailed questions about probate law tonight during dinner. Pretended curiosity. Daniel looked uncomfortable again. October 2nd. Spoke privately with attorney Richard Lawson today. Began adjusting trust protections immediately. November 19th. Melissa believes grief weakens people. I hope she never learns what grief actually does to someone who survives long enough. I traced my fingers slowly across Michael's handwriting. Even now, months after his death, he still sounded steady, observant, protective. I suddenly remembered something else from years ago. One evening after Daniel and Melissa married, Michael stood at this very window watching them drive away after an argument at dinner. "Our son confuses peace with surrender," he told me quietly. At the time I thought he was exaggerating. Daniel always hated conflict growing up. Even as a child he apologized for things that were not his fault just to stop tension in the room. I used to think kindness caused that habit. Now I realize fear caused it too. Around 10 that evening a soft knock sounded against my bedroom door. "Come in," I said. Sophie stepped inside carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one carefully to me before sitting beside me near the window. "Mom keeps talking about schedules downstairs," she whispered. "She already made a list." "A list?" Sophie nodded unhappily. "Things to pack. Repairs before selling the house. Realtors to contact after New Year's." I stared quietly into the steam rising from my tea. Somewhere downstairs, Melissa laughed at something on television. The sound floated faintly through the floorboards like static. "Grandma," Sophie asked carefully, "why is Dad letting this happen?" The question hurt because I did not fully know the answer myself. Part of me wanted to blame Melissa entirely because it was easier, cleaner. But the truth was more painful than that. Melissa manipulated situations skillfully, yes. But Daniel still chose silence every single time it mattered. "Your father spent his whole life avoiding difficult choices," I said softly after a long pause. "Unfortunately, avoiding a decision is still a decision." Sophie looked down at her tea. "Grandpa never acted scared around Mom." I smiled faintly despite myself. "No. Your grandfather saw people very clearly." Another memory surfaced suddenly. Michael sitting in his office one winter afternoon while reviewing paperwork. Melissa had stopped by unexpectedly and spent nearly 30 minutes asking questions about insurance policies and property taxes. After she left, Michael looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said quietly, "That woman studies weakness the way bankers study numbers." I thought he was being dramatic back then. I almost laughed now remembering how right he was. Sophie carefully pulled something from the pocket of her sweatshirt. "I took this from Mom's office earlier." She handed me a folded brochure. My stomach tightened immediately. Silver Pines Senior Living Community. Elegant photographs filled the pages. Smiling elderly couples gardening. Comfortable apartments. Bright dining rooms with fresh flowers on every table. On the back, Melissa had circled a floor plan labeled Assisted Independent Transition Suite. My hands became very still. Transition suite. Even the language sounded temporary. Controlled. Like being gently relocated somewhere convenient. Sophie looked ashamed. "I am sorry." I shook my head slowly. "None of this is your fault." But internally something shifted deeper inside me while holding that brochure. Until now, part of me still believed there might be room for misunderstanding. Confusion. Emotional overreaction fueled by grief. That illusion finally disappeared completely. They were not casually discussing possibilities anymore. They were actively preparing my removal. And they believed I would eventually surrender quietly because sadness had made me weak. The realization settled into me slowly but permanently. I stood and walked toward Michael's side of the closet. Most of his clothes were gone now thanks to Melissa's cleaning projects over the past months, but one navy winter coat still remained hanging near the back. I slipped my hand into the pocket and felt something solid immediately. A business card. Richard Lawson. Family attorney. On the back, Michael had written 3 words in black ink. "Trust Evelyn first." Tears filled my eyes instantly, but this time they felt different. Not helpless. Not shattered. Steady somehow. Grounding. Michael knew exactly what kind of storm would arrive after his death, and even now he was quietly guiding me through it piece by piece. I folded the business card carefully into my robe pocket beside the brass key. Then I turned back towards Sophie. "Tomorrow morning," I said calmly, "I need you to drive me somewhere." Sophie blinked in surprise. "Where?" I looked toward the dark snowy window where the reflection of our Christmas tree lights shimmered faintly against the glass. "To see your grandfather's lawyer." For the first time since Christmas Eve dinner, Sophie smiled. The morning after Christmas arrived gray and bitterly cold. Overnight temperatures had dropped below 20 degrees, leaving thin ice along the edges of the driveway and frosting the neighborhood windows in pale white patterns. I woke before sunrise, long before anyone else in the house stirred awake. For several quiet minutes, I sat in bed listening to the familiar sounds of winter settling around the old house. The heater clicking softly through the vents, wind brushing against the siding. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock in the living room marking each passing second with steady patience. Michael used to say old houses breathed differently in winter. I understood what he meant now. This house had carried decades of secrets, laughter, grief, and silence inside its walls. And lately, silence seemed to be winning. I dressed carefully in dark slacks and a cream wool sweater Michael bought me years ago during a trip to Vermont. The sleeves were slightly too long because he always guessed my size wrong, but I never fixed them because it reminded me of him. Before leaving my bedroom, I opened the nightstand drawer once more and checked the contents carefully. Michael's note, the brass key, Richard Lawson's business card, the trust documents I copied from the attic box during the night. Everything remained exactly where I left it. Organized. Protected. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt something close to steadiness settling beneath my grief. Not happiness. Not peace. Just clarity. Downstairs, the kitchen lights were already on by the time I entered. Melissa stood near the counter stirring cream into her coffee while scrolling through her phone. Her expression immediately sharpened the moment she noticed my coat. "You are up early," she said lightly. "Could not sleep," I replied calmly. Melissa glanced toward the front door. "Are you going somewhere?" I poured myself coffee slowly before answering. "Just out for a little while." Something flickered briefly across her face then. Suspicion. It vanished almost instantly beneath her usual polished expression, but I noticed it anyway. Once you stop doubting yourself, dishonest people become easier to read. "The roads are icy," she said carefully. "Maybe you should wait until Daniel is awake." "I will be fine." Melissa smiled tightly around the rim of her coffee cup. "Well, let us know where you are going at least. In case something happens." There it was again. Concern shaped like control. I looked at her steadily over my coffee mug. "I am 71, Melissa. Not 7. For the first time since Christmas Eve, her smile slipped completely. Just for a second. But it was enough. Upstairs, a bedroom door opened. A few moments later, Sophie appeared carrying her car keys exactly as planned. "Morning," she mumbled casually while avoiding her mother's eyes. Melissa frowned slightly. "Where are you two headed?" Sophie shrugged. "Grandma wanted fresh air." Fresh air. It was a terrible lie, but Melissa looked uncertain enough not to challenge it directly. Daniel wandered downstairs moments later, still half asleep, rubbing his eyes while reaching automatically for the coffee pot. "What is going on?" he asked groggily. "Your mother is apparently going on an adventure," Melissa replied before I could speak. Daniel blinked toward me in confusion. "Mom, everything okay?" I buttoned my coat calmly. "Perfectly fine." He looked relieved by the answer because relief was always easier for Daniel than curiosity. That realization no longer hurt the way it once did. It simply exhausted me. Sophie grabbed her gloves from the counter. "We will not be long." Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly as we walked toward the door. "Try to stay somewhere warm," she called after us. "You know how confusion can get worse in cold weather." Sophie stiffened beside me immediately, but I gently touched her arm before she could react. Then I opened the front door and stepped outside into the freezing morning air without another word. Snow crunched beneath our boots as we crossed the driveway toward Sophie's car. The sky hung low and gray above the neighborhood while smoke drifted lazily from chimneys along the street. Everything looked peaceful, quiet, like the kind of Christmas morning people framed on greeting cards. Strange how appearances could hide almost anything. Sophie gripped the steering wheel tightly the moment we pulled away from the house. I hate her, she whispered suddenly. I looked out the passenger window at snow-covered lawns passing by. Do not waste your heart on hatred, sweetheart. It poisons the person carrying it. Sophie exhaled shakily. How are you this calm? The answer took longer than I expected. Finally I spoke quietly. Because your grandfather prepared me better than they realized. We drove nearly 40 minutes through icy suburban roads before reaching downtown Columbus. Richard Lawson's office occupied the third floor of an old brick building overlooking the riverfront. Michael always liked Richard because he still believed in handwritten notes and proper coffee mugs instead of paper cups. A man who respects small details usually respects important ones too, Michael once said. Sophie waited in the lobby while I took the elevator upstairs alone. The law office smelled faintly like leather chairs and old paper when I stepped inside. A receptionist looked up from behind the front desk and immediately softened when she recognized my name. Mrs. Carter, she said gently. Mr. Lawson will want to see you right away. Richard Lawson looked older than I remembered, more tired around the eyes. But the moment he saw me standing in his doorway, something like concern crossed his face instantly. Evelyn, he said quietly while standing from behind his desk. I was wondering how long it would take before you came here. I closed the office door carefully behind me. You knew. Richard gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Michael asked me to expect this possibility eventually. Hearing someone else confirm it made everything feel heavier somehow. More final. I sat slowly while Richard removed a thick folder from the locked cabinet behind him. Your husband changed nearly every legal structure connected to the estate during the last year of his life, he explained carefully. Trust ownership, property rights, medical authority, financial access. He slid the folder toward me. Because he stopped trusting Melissa completely. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside sat copies of legal documents bearing both Michael's signature and my own. But there was more. Medical directives, protective clauses, written statements from Michael himself detailing specific concerns about coercion and manipulation attempts related to family assets. My pulse slowed painfully as I read. He documented everything, I whispered. Richard nodded grimly. Michael was especially disturbed after Melissa tried convincing him to establish cognitive evaluations for you last spring. I looked up sharply. What? Richard removed his glasses slowly. She claimed she noticed memory problems developing after your husband's diagnosis. She suggested early medical documentation would protect the family later. Family. Always the family. Melissa wrapped every selfish ambition inside that word like ribbon around poison. Michael refused immediately, Richard continued quietly. In fact, that conversation was the final reason he accelerated transferring full control of the estate directly to you. I stared down at the paperwork while cold realization spread through me piece by piece. Melissa had not started planning after Michael died. She started while he was still alive. There is one more thing, Richard said carefully. He opened another section of the file and slid several printed emails toward me. Michael instructed me to preserve these in case legal intervention ever became necessary. I looked down slowly. My stomach tightened immediately. They were emails between Melissa and a financial consultant discussing estimated property values, liquidation timelines, and projected inheritance distribution scenarios, dated nearly 8 months before Michael's funeral. One sentence stood out instantly. Once Evelyn transitions into assisted care, the property can be prepared for market quickly without emotional complications. Emotional complications. That was what my life had become to her. A complication to remove efficiently. I sat there silently for a long time while snow drifted beyond the office windows overlooking the frozen river outside. Finally Richard spoke again. Evelyn, legally speaking, your position is extremely secure. Melissa and Daniel cannot force a sale. They cannot remove you from the home. They cannot access the trust without your direct authorization. I nodded slowly, but strangely, victory did not feel triumphant sitting there in that office. Mostly it felt sad. Sad that Michael spent his final months quietly protecting me from his own son and daughter-in-law, while pretending everything was normal at family dinners. Sad that love sometimes survived longer than loyalty did. Richard leaned forward carefully. What would you like to do now? I looked down at Michael's handwriting one last time before closing the folder gently. Then I lifted my eyes toward the snowy city outside the window and answered in a calm voice that no longer trembled at all. I think it is time they finally understand exactly who they underestimated. By the time Sophie and I returned home that afternoon, the winter sky had darkened into heavy gray clouds again. Snow flurries drifted lazily across the neighborhood, while Christmas decorations glowed softly from neighboring houses. Everything looked warm and peaceful from the outside. The Carter family home probably looked exactly the same. A beautiful two-story house with wreaths hanging in the windows and white lights framing the porch. Nobody passing by would ever guess that inside those walls, an entire family was quietly unraveling. Sophie parked carefully in the driveway while I sat still for a moment looking at the house. Michael spent 41 years protecting this place. Not because it was expensive, not because it impressed people, because it held us. Birthdays, funerals, school mornings, late-night conversations, ordinary love layered carefully over decades. And now Melissa spoke about it like inventory waiting for market conditions to improve. Sophie turned off the engine slowly. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I surprised myself by answering honestly. Yes, as I was. Not emotionally ready. Nothing about this situation would ever feel emotionally ready. But the fear was gone now. Once you finally understand the truth about people, fear loses much of its power. Inside the house, the smell of pot roast drifted from the kitchen the moment we stepped through the front door. Melissa appeared almost immediately from the dining room wearing another perfectly composed smile. "There you are," she said lightly. "We were getting worried." Worried. I removed my gloves slowly while hanging my coat beside the front closet. The roads were slow. Melissa's eyes moved carefully across my face as though searching for signs of confusion or distress. Instead she found calm. That unsettled her more than anger ever would have. Daniel emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Everything okay?" he asked. I looked directly at my son for several quiet seconds before answering. "Actually, yes. I had a very productive morning." Something flickered across Melissa's face then. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. Tiny cracks beginning to form beneath control. "Well," she said smoothly while recovering almost instantly, "dinner will be ready soon." I nodded politely and walked upstairs without offering further explanation. Behind me, I heard Melissa lower her voice sharply the moment I disappeared from sight. Sophie lingered downstairs just long enough to overhear the conversation before joining me in the bedroom 20 minutes later. "Mom asked where we went," she whispered after closing the door. Dad told her she was overreacting. I almost smiled sadly at that. Daniel only recognized problems once they became impossible to ignore. Then Mom asked if you seemed confused while driving. My hands became very still against the folded blanket I was holding. Confused while driving. Melissa was still building her narrative piece by piece. "What did Dad say?" Sophie shrugged unhappily. "He said you seemed normal." Normal. Strange how quickly basic competence becomes a compliment once people start trying to erase your independence. I crossed toward the nightstand and carefully removed the folder Richard Lawson gave me earlier that afternoon. Inside sat copies of every legal protection Michael established before his death. Property ownership records. Trust agreements. Medical authority restrictions. Document after document quietly dismantling every plan Melissa thought she controlled. Sophie watched me carefully. "What happens now?" I slid the folder back into the drawer slowly. "Now we stop reacting emotionally and start paying attention." Downstairs, Melissa called everyone for dinner an hour later. The dining room looked almost identical to Christmas Eve, except for the absence of celebration. Leftover decorations still glowed softly along the windowsills while half-melted candles flickered near the centerpieces. Daniel sat at the head of the table now where Michael used to sit. Somehow seeing that bothered me more tonight than it ever had before. Not because Daniel occupied the chair. Because he seemed completely unaware of the responsibility that came with it. Melissa served dinner with practiced grace while discussing weather forecasts and after-Christmas sales as though our family was perfectly normal. Sophie remained mostly silent beside me. I noticed she no longer looked at her mother the same way. Disappointment changes people quietly too. Halfway through dinner, Melissa finally set down her wine glass and turned toward me with careful politeness. Evelyn, I actually made an appointment for us next week to tour Silver Pines. There it was. Direct now. Public. Planned. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Melissa. What? She replied quickly. We already talked about this. Her eyes returned to me immediately. I just think seeing the place in person would help ease your anxiety. Anxiety. Another useful little word. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate before answering. I will not be going. The room became very still. Melissa blinked once. Excuse me. I said I will not be going. My voice remained calm enough that even I barely recognized it. Daniel immediately leaned forward. Mom, nobody is forcing. Actually, I interrupted quietly while looking directly at him for the first time in days. That seems to be exactly what is happening. Silence crashed across the table. Melissa recovered first, naturally. Evelyn, you are misunderstanding our intentions. No, I said softly. I think I finally understand them perfectly. Daniel's face paled slightly. Melissa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly beside him. We are trying to help you, she repeated again, but the confidence in her voice had weakened now. By photographing my bedroom? I asked calmly. Melissa froze. Daniel looked confused immediately. What? I continued before anyone could interrupt. By discussing assisted living placements before speaking to me? By contacting realtors while I still live here? By describing me as emotionally unstable in private messages? The color drained slowly from Melissa's face. Beside me, Sophie stared down at her plate without moving. Daniel looked back and forth between us in growing confusion. Melissa, he said slowly. What is she talking about? Melissa forced out a strained laugh. I think Evelyn is confused about. Do not, I said quietly. Just 2 words. Calm. Controlled. But the room fell silent instantly afterward. I looked at Melissa steadily across the candlelight. Do not use my grief as evidence of incompetence. For the first time since I met her 18 years ago, Melissa looked genuinely rattled. Not angry. Not polished. Frightened. Because manipulative people depend heavily on controlling perception, and suddenly she no longer controlled the room. Daniel stared at his wife now with visible uncertainty spreading across his face. Melissa, he repeated more firmly this time. What messages? Melissa set her fork down carefully. I was trying to plan responsibly for the future. Without telling me? I asked. She looked directly at me then, and something colder surfaced beneath her usual politeness. Some decisions become necessary whether people are emotionally ready for them or not. There she was. The real Melissa. Not the smiling hostess. Not the concerned daughter-in-law. The woman Michael recognized years before the rest of us did. Daniel rubbed his forehead heavily. Jesus Christ. Do not blame me for being practical, Melissa snapped quietly. Somebody has to think rationally in this family. Rationally. Practical. Necessary. Every cruel thing sounded respectable when wrapped carefully enough. I reached beside my chair then and calmly placed Richard Lawson's folder onto the table between the candles. The sound alone silenced everyone. Melissa's eyes locked onto the folder instantly. Recognition flashed across her face so quickly she could not hide it. What is that? Daniel asked uncertainly. I opened the folder slowly and removed the first document. This, I said quietly, is the trust agreement your father created before he died. Daniel frowned in confusion while Melissa sat completely motionless now. Michael transferred full ownership of this house into my name nearly a year ago. Daniel blinked. What? No sale can happen without my direct consent. No transfer. No relocation decisions. No medical authority claims. I looked directly at Melissa then. And according to Michael's attorney, every attempt to manipulate those protections has already been documented. The silence afterward felt enormous. Melissa stared at me as though seeing an entirely different person sitting across the table now. Perhaps she was. Because the grieving widow she expected to quietly disappear no longer existed. The silence after my words felt almost physical. Heavy enough to press against the walls. The candles flickered softly between us while snow drifted beyond the dark dining room windows, And for several long seconds nobody moved at all. Daniel stared at the trust documents spread across the table, like he no longer recognized the life sitting in front of him. Melissa remained perfectly still beside him, but I noticed the tiny crack finally forming beneath her composure. Fear changes people too, especially people accustomed to control. That is impossible, Daniel said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my son carefully. No. What is impossible is pretending your father did not see this coming. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face slowly as though trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Mom, why would Dad do something like this without telling me? The question hurt more than I expected because even now, after everything, part of Daniel still saw himself as excluded instead of responsible. Because your father understood people very clearly by the end of his life, I answered softly. Melissa finally leaned forward, her voice suddenly sharp beneath the polished calm she usually wore so carefully. Michael was sick. People make irrational decisions when they are scared. Enough, Sophie said quietly from beside me. Every head at the table turned toward her immediately. My granddaughter rarely raised her voice. That was what made the moment feel so important. Sophie looked directly at her mother with tears shining in her eyes. Grandpa was not irrational. He was protecting Grandma because you have been trying to get rid of her for months. Melissa's face hardened instantly. Sophie, you do not understand adult conversations. I understand plenty, Sophie whispered. I saw the messages. Daniel slowly turned toward his wife then. Messages. Melissa looked cornered for the first time since I met her. Daniel, this is getting ridiculous. But Daniel no longer looked uncertain. He looked exhausted. Truly exhausted. Like a man finally realizing how long he ignored things because facing them would have required courage he did not want to find. Did you tell people my mother was mentally unstable? He asked quietly. Melissa crossed her arms defensively. I said she was grieving and struggling emotionally after Michael died. You told a realtor she was confused most days, Sophie interrupted softly. I saw it. Melissa's expression faltered again. Small lies survive easily in darkness. They struggle once spoken aloud at the dinner table beneath Christmas lights. Daniel stared at his wife in disbelief. Jesus Christ, Melissa. Do not act shocked now, she snapped suddenly. You agreed this house was too much for her. That is not the same thing. Really? Melissa laughed bitterly. Because from where I am standing, your mother has been living in a giant house alone while the rest of us clean up after her emotionally for almost a year. I looked at her quietly across the table. Emotionally. Melissa met my eyes directly now, and for the first time all evening she stopped pretending kindness entirely. Do you have any idea what it is like living with constant grief in this house? Everything revolves around Michael. His chair. His office. His routines. Nobody can move forward because you refuse to let anything change. The words landed hard because somewhere beneath her cruelty sat traces of truth. Grief had filled this house like fog since Michael died. But grief is not selfish simply because other people grow uncomfortable around it. Your father died too, I said softly while looking at Daniel. But apparently I was the only person expected to mourn quietly. Daniel looked down at the table immediately. Melissa stood abruptly from her chair. I am tired of being treated like some kind of villain because I wanted practical solutions. Practical solutions? Sophie repeated sharply. You tried convincing people Grandma was mentally unstable. I was trying to protect this family financially. There it was at last. Financially. The truth finally standing in the middle of the room without disguise. Daniel stared at Melissa like he no longer recognized her. Is that what this was really about? Melissa threw up her hands in frustration. This house is worth nearly $900,000, Daniel. We are drowning in bills while she lives alone in rooms she barely uses anymore. The room fell silent again. But this silence felt different now. Honest. Ugly. Final. Melissa's eyes widened slightly the moment she realized what she had admitted aloud. Sophie looked devastated. Daniel looked physically sick. And strangely I felt calm. Completely calm. Because at least the masks were finally gone. Thank you, I said quietly. Melissa frowned in confusion. For what? For finally saying the truth instead of wrapping it in concern. Melissa stared at me speechlessly while I slowly closed the folder of legal documents in front of me. You never wanted to help me, I continued softly. You wanted this house. Daniel pushed back from the table suddenly and stood. I need air. Without another word, he walked out of the dining room toward the back porch. The sliding glass door slammed harder than he intended a few seconds later. Snow blew briefly inside before the door shut again. Melissa looked furious now. Running away. As usual. Sophie stood too. Maybe he is just realizing what kind of person you are. Melissa turned sharply toward her daughter. Do not you dare speak to me like that. Why not? Sophie's voice trembled now with years of bottled disappointment. You speak to Grandma like she is some problem you need to manage. Melissa looked stunned. Truly stunned. Not because Sophie challenged her. Because she clearly never imagined her daughter would stop admiring her. That was the thing manipulative people often forget. Children eventually become old enough to notice patterns. Go to your room, Melissa ordered coldly. Sophie looked toward me instead. I gave her a small nod. Not because she deserved punishment. Because she deserved peace away from this conversation. Sophie swallowed hard before quietly leaving the dining room. Melissa and I remained alone together after that except for the faint sound of football commentary drifting from the television in the other room. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then finally Melissa sat back down slowly. Her anger seemed smaller now somehow. Tired around the edges. You think you won, she said quietly. I looked toward the Christmas tree glowing softly in the living room. No, I answered honestly. There are no winners sitting at this table tonight. Something in my voice must have surprised her because she stopped looking angry for a moment. Just human. Michael never liked me, she admitted quietly. Michael saw people clearly, I replied. She looked down at her untouched dinner plate. I did love Daniel. I believe you. Melissa laughed softly without humor. That almost makes this worse. Maybe it did. Because selfishness attached to love becomes far more destructive than selfishness alone. I stood slowly from the table and gathered a few empty dishes before carrying them toward the kitchen sink. The familiar motions felt strangely comforting. Water running softly. Porcelain touching countertops. Ordinary sounds continuing despite emotional wreckage. Melissa remained seated in the dining room behind me. What happens now? She finally asked. I dried my hands carefully on a dish towel before answering. Now. I turned back toward her calmly. Now you and Daniel need to decide whether you still know how to be a family when there is nothing left to inherit. Her face tightened slightly at the words. Not angry this time. Wounded. Because deep down she understood exactly how true they were. Upstairs I heard Sophie's bedroom door close softly. Outside, snow continued falling across the backyard where Michael once hung Christmas lights every December no matter how cold the weather became. He used to say homes required maintenance just like marriages did. Attention. Patience. Honesty. Neglect either one long enough and cracks eventually spread everywhere. Later that night, after Melissa disappeared upstairs and Daniel remained sitting silently on the back porch staring into the snow for nearly an hour, I walked alone through the quiet house turning off Christmas lights one by one. The living room glowed softly in the darkness while old ornaments reflected tiny points of color against the tree branches. I paused beside Michael's recliner and rested my hand gently against the worn leather armrest. You were right, I whispered quietly into the empty room. Then I looked around the house we built together. The house they tried to take from me while calling me a burden. And for the first time since Michael died, this place no longer felt haunted by grief alone. It felt protected.